I'm Emma Nicole Lewis, author of historical fiction time-slip novels. My novel A Shadow Beyond is set in England's Peak District in a village called Eyam, that for 14 months during the 17th century suffered the outbreak of plague. Whilst my novel is a work of fiction, it does contain real-life characters and events. And today, I'm returning to walk in the footsteps of those characters once again and give a background tour to the influence and creation of A Shadow Beyond. Nestled in the heart of the Peak District's Hope Valley is the picturesque and very tranquil looking village of Eyam. But it's not just its natural beauty that brings people from far and wide to the village of Eyam. Eyam has a history, a humbling and horrifying history. And that begins in 1665, when plague came to the village. This series of mini-documentaries covers the famous and fascinating place that Eyam has in British history, and of the people who so bravely and tragically sacrificed their own lives in order to prevent the spread of plague through more of Derbyshire. Through this village's amazing heritage, you will discover the story behind the story of my historic time-slip novel, A Shadow Beyond. You will see the places where the plot unfolds for Rachel, my historic fictitious character, and Kate, the present-day character. This is the story of Eyam, the plague village. The story of plague doesn't actually start here at Plague Cottage. In my novel, A Shadow Beyond, we start to see hints of an impending doom through folklore and superstition. Imagine the outcry when here at the church, during divine service with a relatively new Reverend William Mompesson, when a young cow was driven into the church. For many, this act that would have defiled the sanctity of service would have been seen as a portent. When I was researching and writing A Shadow Beyond, I visited Eyam a lot, and I found it easy to lose myself in the stories and the beautiful surroundings of the village. On the edge of the village, there's a derelict old building that was my inspiration for Thornycroft Hall. It's here that my historic, fictitious heroine, Rachel, works as a servant for the Thornycroft family. We read about the events leading up to plague through Rachel's point of view, but they are all based on stories and fact that are linked to the village at that time. In late August 1665, a journeyman tailor, George Vickers, took delivery of a parcel of cloth from plague-infested London. The cloth contained fleas carrying the plague, and when George shook it out, he was bitten. In A Shadow Beyond, the arrival of the cloth causes quite a stir, and Lady Cecily of Thornycroft Hall insists that she must have a dress made of the latest London fashion. Rachel is to go into the village and ensure George Vickers visits for Lady Cecily's measurements. He never appears. It's when Rachel's visiting the Mompessons that we learn of the fate of George Vickers. And much like it probably was in real life, that's when the rumours of plague began. By the end of September, more members of the Hadfield household, where George Vickers was staying, had died. It wasn't long before the neighbouring cottages were infected as well. and by the end of October, the death count in the village was already at 29. Eyam was entering a crisis. Eyam Museum sits on the site that Bradshaw Hall once stood. The Bradshaws and the Sheldons were wealthy families living in the village in 1665. They were the inspiration for the Thornycroft family. Like the Bradshaws and the Sheldons, the Thornycrofts had the means to flee Eyam when the plague began to take hold. And so we're left in December 1665 with Rachel pretty much alone in Thornycroft Hall. And she's living not only with the consequences of plague, but with the legend that haunts the house, the sinister and frightening legend of Sir Thornycroft's first mad and deceased wife. The boundary stone is a marker that separates the village of Eyam from its neighbouring village of Stony Middleton, still uninfected by the plague. The villagers would use the stone to drop coins that they'd douse in vinegar to wash away the plague seed in return for food and medical supplies. It's easy to imagine Rachel and her fellow villagers walking up this undulating track with their handcarts in readiness to collect their food supplies. At one point during A Shadow Beyond, Rachel looks out across these fields sprawling from the boundary stone into Stony Middleton. She daydreams of the freedom from pestilence lying beyond them. And there must have been many who, like Rachel, looked at this magnificent view whilst dreaming of an impossible escape. The Reverend William Mompesson was still relatively new to the village, and many of the parishioners still chose to follow the previous Puritan clergyman, Thomas Stanley. In springtime of 1666, these two remarkable men decided to put their differences in religion aside so that they could impose some significant decisions. The first was to stop all organised funerals. That meant they needed to get the bodies interred to the ground as quickly as possible to prevent the further spread of contagion. The second was to stop holding divine service in the church, and instead they decided to take it out to the village amphitheatre, known as the Cucklet Delph. It was here, on top of this imposing limestone archway, that the Reverend William Mompesson would have delivered that final decision that gave the village of Eyam its place in history. In June 1666, a cordon sanitaire was put into place by the Reverend William Mompesson, with Thomas Stanley stood by his side. Nobody was to enter the village, but nobody was to leave. In A Shadow Beyond, we witness Rachel's conflicting thoughts, her desire to do the right thing, to do her duty to God, and her need to survive. Now we're here under this limestone rock at the Cucklet Delph, where that all-important decision to implement the cordon sanitaire was made. I wanted to read you a short extract from the book A Shadow Beyond. God had spoken to them using the mouth of William Mompesson. He had asked them to make a sacrifice and stay, but in doing so, he had not bound their hands or fenced them in like cattle in a pen. There was still a choice to be made for her and Benjamin. That was both their gift and their curse. To stay would mean that their bodies would likely surrender to the destruction of the pestilence, but to defy the cordon sanitaire and leave would mean that whatever life they would get to live, they would be handing their souls to the devil. Taking a step forward and then another, Rachel walked beyond the great limestone arch, leaving the echoes of grief and fear behind her. At her feet, a single dandelion swayed in the breeze, its seeds a puffball of off-white. With a neat snap, she plucked it from the ground. Milky white liquid gathered around the end of the stalk. As she gently blew the seeds into the warm summer air, she silently made her choice. There must have been many like Rachel who would have battled with their God-fearing instincts and their survival instincts on that day when the decision to implement the cordon sanitaire was made. By summer of 1666, the death count in Eyam had risen dramatically. Whole families had been wiped out, sometimes even in as little as a week. It wasn't just the families in the heart of the village who were at threat from plague. Families such as the Talbots, the Hancocks, those who lived on the edges of the village of Eyam, were also very much at threat. If you've already read A Shadow Beyond, or you're familiar with the plague story of Eyam, then you'll know that the Riley graves play a very poignant part in the rich history of this village. The Talbots and the Hancocks both lived on the edge of the village, up the track here at the Riley farm. And it was here that for both families, tragedy struck. In July 1666, all members of the Talbot family perished, although it is rumoured that a baby survived and was taken in by the Hancocks. Then, on the 3rd of August, the first 2 victims of the Hancock family were taken by plague. In just 1 week, Elizabeth Hancock lost her husband and all 6 children who lived on the farm with them. Being set apart from the main village and with so many others suffering the merciless consequences of plague, Elizabeth buried all of them alone. After researching and writing A Shadow Beyond, it's really quite emotional coming back up here to the Riley graves where the Hancock family are buried. I really wanted to convey the raw human emotion element of the tragedy that happened in Eyam. And I wanted to convey what Elizabeth Hancock and her family must have been through all those many centuries ago. In November 1666, when the last death linked to Eyam's plague outbreak was recorded, 260 villagers had lost their lives. There were many who suffered and perished during the 14 months that plague ravaged this village. Every family at that time had a story to tell. And although Rachel's story is fictitious, I tried to use her relationships and experiences with the real-life characters to paint a picture of what I imagine they must have endured at that dreadful time. Their bravery, their fear, their daily horror, and the way friendship bonds may have flourished or suffered as a result of plague. But even though so many were so cruelly and tragically taken, thanks to the historians and Museum of Eyam, their memory and the historic sacrifice they made still lives on, hundreds of years later.
You got all the answers to my questions, and I've got the sight to see us to the end. If the world wasn't so crowded, then I would find you. If we all just stopped distancing our friends.
I put so much time into nothing with so little to show. And the light that you brought me, oh how that light used to glow. But it felt like the sun